Adelaide woke before sunrise, as she had every morning since arriving at Whitlock Ranch. The first frost had silvered the grass, and a cold wind slipped through the cracks of the cookhouse walls. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and began preparing breakfast. The ranch hands soon appeared, sleepy and hungry, but there was laughter among them now. Nobody stared at her worn dress anymore. Nobody questioned whether she belonged. Adelaide had earned their respect one meal at a time. As she kneaded bread, she noticed Silas standing outside the kitchen door, watching quietly. Their eyes met, and he smiled before walking away. The change in Silas had become impossible for Adelaide to ignore. At first, he had spoken to her only about ranch business, asking about supplies, meals, and winter preparations. Now he found reasons to stop by the kitchen. Sometimes he brought firewood. Sometimes he carried a sack of flour. Once he repaired the loose window shutter without saying a word. Adelaide understood what those small gestures meant, but she refused to assume too much. She had spent too many years trusting promises that disappeared like smoke. Still, whenever Silas entered the kitchen, something warm stirred inside her that had nothing to do with the stove. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled across the ranch, forcing the cattle hands back early. The wind howled against the buildings, and rain hammered the roof. Adelaide immediately began preparing a large pot of stew, knowing the men would return cold and exhausted. Ezra helped her chop onions while Silas secured the barn doors outside. Suddenly, a frightened horse broke loose from its stall and ran toward the open pasture. Silas chased after it through the rain, but the animal slipped near the creek. Without hesitation, Adelaide grabbed a lantern and followed him. She found Silas struggling in the mud and helped guide the horse back towards safety. By the time they returned to the cookhouse, both were soaked through. Adelaide laughed when she saw mud covering Silas from his boots to his shoulders. He looked at her and laughed too. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, but inside the little kitchen, everything felt strangely peaceful. Silas reached for a towel and gently placed it around Adelaide's shoulders. She looked up at him, surprised by the tenderness in his eyes. "You shouldn't have followed me out there," he said quietly. Adelaide smiled. Someone had to make sure the rancher didn't get himself killed. Silas shook his head, amused. "You're becoming quite difficult to argue with." That evening, the entire crew gathered around the long table while Adelaide served steaming bowls of stew and fresh bread. The men praised her cooking as usual, but Silas barely noticed the conversation. His attention kept returning to Adelaide as she moved from one plate to another. Gideon noticed and exchanged a knowing glance with Boyd. Neither man said anything, but their smiles told Silas they had seen enough. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Silas remained outside the cookhouse. Adelaide stepped onto the porch and found him waiting beneath the cold stars. "I wanted to thank you," he said. She smiled softly. "For the stew?" Silas shook his head. "For making this place feel like home." The next morning, Adelaide found a small wooden box beside her stove. Inside was a pair of sturdy leather boots, carefully made, and far better than anything she had owned in years. She immediately knew who had left them there. When Silas entered the kitchen, she held the box toward him and asked why he had done it. He looked almost embarrassed. "Your old boots have carried you far." "Enough," he said. "You deserve something that won't leave you bleeding after every mile." Adelaide ran her fingers over the leather, remembering the day she had first walked into the ranch. She thanked him softly, unable to hide her smile. Silas did not press her for anything more. He simply went about his morning work, leaving Adelaide alone with thoughts she could no longer push aside. The boots were not expensive, but they meant more than their price. Someone had noticed her pain without asking her to explain it. Someone had remembered how she arrived. For years, Adelaide had survived by expecting nothing from anyone. It had been easier that way. Expectations could disappoint, while loneliness could simply be endured. But Silas was slowly teaching her that kindness did not always come with a price. Sometimes a person could give simply because they cared. A week later, trouble arrived at the ranch in the form of a harsh winter wind that damaged the northern fence. Silas and Gideon spent most of the day repairing it, while Adelaide prepared food for the men. By evening, everyone was exhausted. When Silas returned to the cookhouse, Adelaide noticed the deep cut across his hand. She immediately brought clean water and wrapped the wound with a strip of cloth. "It's nothing," he protested. She gave him a stern look. "That is what men say, before something becomes something." Silas smiled. He sat quietly while she worked, watching her careful hands. When she finished, he said, "You take care of everyone." Adelaide lowered her eyes. "Someone has to." Silas gently lifted her chin so she would look at him. "Who takes care of you?" The question struck deeper than he intended. Adelaide became silent. Nobody had asked her that in years. Her father had once been the person who cared for her, but he was gone. After his death, she had learned to survive alone. Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Silas did not push her. He simply rested his hand over hers and said, "You don't have to do everything alone anymore." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. That night, the ranch fell quiet beneath a sky filled with stars. Adelaide stood outside the cookhouse wearing her new boots, looking across the dark pasture. Silas joined her and stood beside her without speaking. After a while, Adelaide whispered, "When I first came here, I thought I was only looking for work." Silas smiled. "And now?" She turned toward him. "Now I think I found something I wasn't brave enough to ask for." Silas understood. He reached for her hand, giving her plenty of time to pull away. She didn't. Their fingers slowly intertwined. No grand promise was made that night. They simply stood together beneath the cold Montana sky, two lonely people who had finally found a place where neither had to walk alone.